and welcome to the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. I am one of your regular hosts, Neal Ford, and you're going to hear a lot of familiar voices today because we're swapping hats, and two of your regular hosts are sitting in the much more comfortable, cushier guest chairs today in our luxurious podcast studio, and they're going to be here talking about this document called Looking Glass. I'm joined today by Ken and Mike. Hi, Ken and Mike.
Hello. Hello.
They are regular hosts, but today they one of their many hats within ThoughtWorks is they are members of Octo, which is the Office of the Chief Technology Officer. And one of the things that Octo is tasked to do as advisory to Rebecca, our CTO, is try to imperfectly look into the future as much as possible to help us make decisions about technology. Where should we be going and where should we be putting our effort, et cetera. And that is an internal document, publication, I guess we could call it, called Looking Glass. But in the grand tradition of ThoughtWorks, things that are valuable, we like to make public because we believe a rising tide raises all ships. And so we started publishing Looking Glass to give you some insight into our decision process. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with Ken and Mike, is the most recent edition of Looking Glass and this idea of lenses. There are 6 lenses in our Looking Glass. Each of those is a perspective on technology in the near-term future. So we're going to talk about the 6 that exist on our Looking Glass, and then we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into a few of them. So let's talk about the lenses that show up on this most recent edition of Looking Glass, whose, if you want to read the actual document, is in the resources link for our podcast. So let's talk about the first one here, platforms as products.
Sure. So I'll take that one. It's kind of because some of these repeat, which is, we think, a good thing, I should say, right up front. If you read last year's Looking Glass, some of these may look familiar. We actually say internally that if they don't repeat a little bit from year to year, we probably were wrong. Because, well, there is some short-term stuff here. There's hopefully some longer-term. But there is a little bit different focus. So this year with the platforms as products, we're focusing on the as products, which means treat the people that are using the platform as real customers, get constant feedback, do internal training, do internal marketing, really a product focus on developing and using platforms.
Yeah, and I think that's important because lots of folks are investing a lot in platform builds and platform rebuilds, and often are disappointed with the outcomes. And so this is something that ThoughtWorks talks a lot about in both on our website and on podcasts and in this report, is how to do platform building well. And this year's advice is to have this product focus, to think about the customers for it and so on. Previous years, we've had different angles of advice, around aligning on what you want to get out of your platform and that kind of thing. But this year's is all about that product focus.
And I think as much as anything, this is about putting our perspective, because I don't know of any other term that has hit so much semantic diffusion out in our world as platform now, because everybody talks about platform as the end-all solution for everything. So we talk about platforms too, but we have a very specific perspective on platforms and the way they're done well, and the way they're not done well. And I think that's what we're trying to convey here.
Yeah, no, I almost think you shouldn't use the word platform on its own, because it's not information rich enough, right? Like, so do you mean infrastructure platform? Do you mean API platform? Do you mean platform business, which is something entirely different and much less about technology and much more about a business model? All of those are flavors of platform. So yeah, very important to say what you mean in this space. So the next lens is hostile tech. And so that's something that has also been in the Looking Glass for the past 3 years. And that's really around tackling challenges that arise from security, ethics, and privacy, all of which are important in the technology space. And I think just the phrase hostile tech itself raises some eyebrows, and that's deliberate on our parts. And we want to kind of make it clear that depending on who you are, you might consider some of the things running on your computer, running on the smartphone, some of the systems that you interact with on a day-to-day basis as actually being hostile to you, depending on your perspective. Because if a business is selling advertising and selling my eyeball time, if I am unclear about that or don't feel like I'm getting value for that, that's kind of maybe a little bit of a hostile act. So that's why we use that name for this. And kind of dive in a little bit to some of the issues there. It's a very big space, so we have to take a particular angle on that each year. But it is important to think about all the stuff around technology.
And Mike makes a really good point there, where it's some people's opinions will differ on these. Inside my own home, my partner very much values seeing advertisements that apply to her, so she can get the discount on the thing. Whereas I don't want to be tracked and to let them know what ad I saw on some social app, so I can see the other one. So, the real key here is that, of course, things that you think of as illegal, hacking, malware, those sorts of things are hostile, of course. But we want to openly call out the misuse of private data as hostile. So the next one is partnering with AI. So artificial intelligence is everywhere, as we all know. The real call out to the lens this year, though, is that it's really becoming more mainstream, and we think it needs to become or should become more mainstream in our clients and partners and so forth. What that means is we don't have a department of artificial intelligence. We don't have a group off in the corner somewhere that does the AI, or some mind over there, some electronic mind that's doing the AI. That you really need to think about AI as part of your everyday projects. How can it help your people be more effective? There's examples everywhere from clothing retailers that get suggestions based on your past purchases and then help you narrow it down, to using AI to help write code, which I think Mike's been playing around with a little bit lately.
Yeah, and I think we're going to do a deeper dive into this once we finish going through the lenses here. But this one's super topical. So 3 of the lenses we've picked on as being newsworthy recently, and we'll dive deeper into them. So we'll come back to this one in a minute. The next lens that we include in our looking glass is called Making the Metaverse. So last year there was, and still now, there's tons of metaverse hype. People using that word to apply to an awful lot of things. And really what we think is important is the digital interactions becoming deeper and richer. And that's really the thing that is important here, rather than maybe just the kind of the splashy headlines around what people are doing in the metaverse. I also think metaverse is one of these words that has gone the platform route, in which it's kind of not, some people are meaning you're using the metaverse to mean just almost anything to do with digital tech these days, and some folks it thinks it's all about the 3D embodied internet, which to me is the thing that I identify most closely with metaverse. But then there's also folks who want to tie the metaverse and Web3 together as concepts and kind of make them reinforcing or even required things one for the other. So I think and we'll dive into this in a bit more detail later, but this is another one of those ones where you really need to cut through the hype and demystify some of what's going on there.
Yeah, which I'll actually use as a bridge to introduce the next one, because we are going to go into it a little bit deeper. The next one is evaluating Web3. And the key here is to understand that where Web 2 was an observation by some folks of what they thought had happened to the web. That things have added, and they had been added to it, e-commerce and others. And they're like, this is kind of a 2.0 of the web. In this case, there are people saying what they think Web3 should be. So it's people with their own biases and reasons for it, which we can talk about how justified and evil some of those are. No, I didn't say evil, but I did say evil. But we think there is more to it. So if you think of Web3 as the distribution and the re-decentralization of the internet, and decentralized identity and so forth. There is some value there. Trading crypto is not that value, if you ask me personally, but there is some value to some of the underlying technology.
And that's the other one we're going to do a deeper dive into in just a moment. So let's wrap up the last one here, and we'll do a deeper dive into the three.
Sure. And the last lens, and these are all kind of storylines within the technology landscape, is accelerating sustainability. So that's both about the accelerating need to tackle the climate crisis and move to a more sustainable world, but also the accelerating response that we're seeing through technology, through policy, through the kinds of things that people are thinking about. Lots of organizations have, a chief sustainability officer these days. And actually, if you look at the CES coverage from last week, actually sustainability was a really big watchword there, with lots of brands kind of getting on board with that as being part of their positioning, and their sustainability stance being something that they are pitching to consumers as being something that those folks who are choosing between brands and choosing providers and services should be thinking about sustainability. So the Looking Glass lens there talks a lot about that and what's going on in that space.
I was going to say the important thing there, I think, is both in the large and the small, because Amazon in particular has got has been focusing a lot on this, and the choices that you make as a developer or an architect can have big implications as to how hot the data is and how cold it is, because the colder it is, the more sustainable it is, because it's not on spinning platters. And so, some seemingly trivial decisions can have long-term implications on things like sustainability. And it's something that awareness, not just at the corporate, enterprise architecture level, but at the individual decision level, can have an impact.
Yeah. I think one thing kind of to plug, please go read the entire report, is that we try to give actionable advice on all these things. It's the time of year when all these types of reports come out, and you got the Consumer Electronics Show and those kinds of things. And a lot of that's observational. A lot of that is, this is what happened last year. There's a lot of advice in here about what we think that clients should do and what readers should do and what we need to do internally. And on sustainability, it's funny that Neal brought up Amazon, because I live in Seattle, which is the headquarters. And Amazon recently sponsored one of the sports stadiums, and they didn't call it Amazon Stadium or something like that. They called it Climate Pledge Arena. And so one of the things under sustainability, the advice is there is a market value. There is a consumer awareness value to being sustainable over and above the amount of carbon you're using and everything else. It's kind of funny that Amazon's got 1,000 trucks running around here.
I was going to say, this is a podcast, so people can't see the look on Neal's face when you were mentioning Climate Pledge Arena, because the cognitive dissonance that was happening in his head was pretty serious there. But that speaks to the branding importance of sustainability, if nothing else.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was the point, is that for a lot of these lenses, we actually, when we're coming up with it, there's like, that's not really Metaverse, is it? No, but when they say it's Metaverse, they're much more likely to get investors. And that is true. That is the business reality of many of these lenses. Some of these are about what you look like. Perception is reality, and that sort of thing.
Well, that's a good segue back to, sorry, Neal, go ahead.
I was going to say exactly what you were saying. That's a good segue back to the metaverse. And we were talking about semantic diffusion earlier. It seems like in the metaverse, they're almost encouraging semantic diffusion to happen as much as possible, so that you can just label anything as metaverse and sort of get away with it. Because I don't think I've ever seen a term move from meaningful to meaningless in such a short period of time.
Well, I'd agree. And what we tried to do there, I wrote an article on this a couple of months ago. We tried to disambiguate the main usages that we've seen of the word metaverse. And so the first one, I'm just going to call it Zuckerberg's embodied internet, right? So that's the, avatars in your living room, holograms in your living room, 3D everything, Ready Player One. It's the Meta announcement from last year when they did the name change from Facebook. It's all of that kind of stuff. It's the sort of the high-end Hollywood graphics version of the internet, right? So the embodied internet. That is something that people often can be meaning when they're talking about the metaverse. The second potential meaning of the metaverse is actually to do with Web3. So that's kind of the ownership economy, evolution of the internet. You need to be able to sell things to people online for them to bother to spend time in the metaverse and do all that stuff. So there's kind of the money version of a metaverse. And then the third major use of metaverse is actually the industrial metaverse. So that's things like NVIDIA partnering with Siemens to build kind of a virtual factory and to be able to map that to a real physical factory and then kind of go back and forth between the physical and the digital and get value out of being able to do things within your digital version of that factory that can be used to then deploy to the real world version of the factory. The canonical example of that actually is Tesla, where they made a change to the way they were building the cars that rerouted some of the cabling so they could take the car from 200 to 250, I don't know what the units are. Megawatts sounds a bit too much. Anyway, they significantly increased the charge rate on the vehicle. Kilowatts, that's it. 200 to 250 kilowatt charge rate. And that was actually like a software change for all the robots. And so they deployed that software change to their continuous delivery pipeline, which you can think of in a way as sort of an industrial metaverse simulation thing, which said, yep, everything will be fine. Then they deployed that to the real factory, and then 3 hours later, new cars were coming out that had a new characteristic based on this digital software change that they had made. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the main thing with the metaverse, right? Is you've got to figure out, what is somebody talking about? Are they talking about the 3D thing? Are they talking about this Web3 thing? Are they talking about like digital twins and industrial stuff?
Yeah. And it was funny because when we were trying to figure out the advice for this one, it's very, very situational. And so like we're saying, okay, if I'm a big shoe manufacturer, should I go open a store in the metaverse? Again, whatever that means. And you know what? The answer might be yes. Meet your customers where they are. If the people who are collecting your brand of basketball player branded shoes, not to mention any names, and that's where they are because they're playing games there and they're bought onto the Zuckerberg train, then by all means, set up a storefront there and play with them. I was watching some of the stuff on YouTube today from CES. And, I don't know if anybody would call this metaverse, but one of the things we talked about is for most people, like the augmented reality part of the metaverse is probably the more impactful. And the Caterpillar booth, Caterpillar had a booth at CES. So first get your head around that. But part of their booth was you could sit down in a control center and you're driving a tractor that was in the next state over. It was in Arizona, 400 and some miles away. So not autonomous. They've had autonomous dump trucks for quite some time, but this was an actual operator who could look around and see what they were doing and move earth. And next to them was somebody doing the same thing with a backhoe that was in a different state. And so, is that metaverse? I don't know, but they're sitting there in an augmented reality type of situation, looking to their left, seeing what's on the left of the piece of machinery, and using levers and moving that rock. So it's pretty interesting.
Well, that to me seems like, the analogy that I go back to is I used to read a lot of science fiction when I was a kid that was written in the 1950s. And a lot of those were ships that were, traveling through the galaxies, and all the scientists on the ships had slide rules with them because you could imagine the spaceship, but you couldn't imagine the pocket calculator. The obvious easy things are the ones that you miss and not the big grand things. And so much of the metaverse stuff is the big grand, physical presence, going to a concert in the metaverse, setting aside for a moment that sounds like a terrible, terrible way to see a concert. But okay, if the capability is there, some people might take advantage of it. But I think, and Ken touched on this, I think where at least the early win is going to be is around augmented reality and helping reality rather than replacing it. And I think that's also true with another one of our lenses about AI. Rather than having AI replace developers, I think it's going to become a really useful research tool for developers, sort of like Google on steroids. And of course, the obvious recent example of this one is GPT and Copilot.
Yeah, and I mean, so we've had an internal thread on this because as a software company, we've now got AI tools that can just write the code for us. So are we all out of a job here? And I'm pretty sure most of the listeners would be skeptical that programmers are going to be out of a job, having been told many times in the history of their careers that there's some new thing that has come along that will render programmers obsolete and we don't don't need them anymore. Hello low code, hello 4GLs, whatever the
COBOL, that was the original selling point of COBOL, was get rid of the pesky programmers and let the business people write the code directly.
Exactly. And the reason that we call the lens partnering with AI is because, and we've been using this word partnering for a while, is that the point is to let both humans and machines play to their strengths. And the phenomenal thing that the machines can do is crunch tons and tons of data. They're really great at pattern matching. And so when you look at something like GitHub Copilot that I've been using pretty extensively recently, some of the stuff it can do is fantastic. But I would say it has about a 50% hit rate. So on being fantastic versus producing something that won't even compile or was completely wrong or is just made up or guessing, doesn't fit my code base, all those kinds of things, right? Even when these things, so ChatGPT, for example, I was trying to get it to write some code for me and it did an okay job, but any programmer would be able to look at that and see all of the limitations in what it had produced. It didn't answer the problem that I was really asking it from a simple, one sentence description of what I was trying to do. And so what I think is actually most likely to happen there is that there is a place for these tools in accelerating professional programmers in getting their craft done, but they are not things that you just let run off on their own because funnily enough, the code that ChatGPT produces is exactly the same as the English language prose that it produces, which is plausible looking, highly self-confident, but wrong in subtle ways. So it does that with English. It does that with program code too.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is like it's when it creates something that won't compile. Okay, I know that's wrong. No problem. To me, and this is where a lot of the lenses play with each other. Because is there a hostile tech angle to AI generated content and code? Whatever. That's the problem is when it's plausible. Like if you use some of these tools, like there's a ton of them out there marketed right now for people that are writing content. And Mike and I did a lot of the authoring on Looking Glass, and we actually played with a few of them. We gave them bullet points and said, what would it say? And the danger is that quite often it was plausible. It was, if I didn't know anything about the topic and I read it, I was like, wow, okay, this is really insightful. The problem was it was wrong. And so, they're only as good as the data that they find. And so, what is that AI trained on? Is it trained on a model that was good? By whose definition of good is also another question, of course. But the danger to me isn't the stuff, as I mentioned, that doesn't compile. The danger is the stuff to me where someone like me who hasn't written real code in many, many years will look at it and go, okay, that makes sense. And I'll deploy it. And in fact, it's using twice as much energy, or what have you. It's just not well written.
Well, and that's a fundamental problem with these things. If it's slurping up all the examples of sorting on the internet, I've got to think that most of the sorting code on the internet is pretty terrible. that just looking at all of them and trying to distill what most people are doing is probably not the optimum course for a lot of things that require, actual, intelligence and taste and evaluation and et cetera.
Well, I thought it was quite funny. There was a Reddit thread on the fact that Stack Overflow had supposedly banned AI generated answers to Stack Overflow because they were plausible but wrong. And somebody else commented, well, isn't that the entirety of Stack Overflow answers that are plausible but wrong? Which that was pretty funny.
But I think curated plausible but wrong is better than randomly plausible but wrong. So, but I think that's a fundamental problem. There's been a lot of talk about, are tools like ChatGPT going to take over from Google and search? But one of the problems with things like ChatGPT is that you don't know the lineage of where this information is coming from and how did they reach conclusions. It's by its nature, it's adding interpretation into, just this. Of course, Google search is doing that too, just in a much less obvious, heavy-handed way.
Well, and I mean, coming back to the tie-in to hostile tech, if I was a, evil genius of some kind who, I don't know what, if I could harness these tools to write sort of politically influencing opinion individually targeted at people, based on their own preferences and tuned to the way that they see the world and talking to them in a language, dialect, and idiom that appeals to them, surely I'd have a super powerful tool for, subverting world governments and stuff like that. And I'm not suggesting anyone, who owns an AI company and a social media platform might be doing any of that kind of thing. But, if I wanted to do bad stuff in the world and I own both the social media platform and AI company, there's a lot of things you could imagine stringing together on that, on all of those.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's also where, like, one of the bigger conversations we had around metaverse and stuff is the metaverse, or are the metaverse and Web3 one thing, or are they two things, or what's the interaction there? Because there's a lot of people inside ThoughtWorks, outside, everywhere, that think that they're tied at, joined at the hip, whatever the idiom you want to use is. And we were like, you can't have a metaverse without crypto payments. It's like, well, why not? We've been able to take digital payments for some time now. Again, that's one thing that happens quite a bit in my household. I think the Amazon drivers know us well. And so, I mean, digital payments are not difficult. And so does it need to be tied together? And I'm curious, because Mike's much more into Web3 than I am. But at least knows more about it.
Yeah, into's a loaded term there.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to accuse you of anything untoward there. But I mean, when we really look at these and said, there's a lot about Web3 that is decentralization, which might be the selling point for Metaverse, but that's certainly not what they're trying to do, right? Because
and I think
Mark wants you to come to his Metaverse.
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, so why is Facebook building a Metaverse? It's because they see it as the next major forum for human beings interacting with each other, and they'd like to own that. Like the fact that Apple, goodness gracious, puts limits around the amount of tracking you can do to people with apps on their platform actually, is listed by Facebook in their quarterly earnings as an impediment on their business model that Apple would put any kind of a restriction in place. You say what you want about the Apple tax on the store and the fact that Apple is raking in money from owning a platform. What Facebook is doing is building their own thing, and in their first early developer release, where you can pay content producers for their content, the Meta cut on that was 50%. I'm like, could they signal this any more clearly? What they're trying, I mean, at least be a little bit covert about the fact that you're trying to own the next major platform for humans connecting to each other and just siphon money out of it. So I think, I mean, my point is that whenever you talk about these things, and Web3 is another one, you actually really have to look at the motivations of the person doing the talking to unveil a little bit more about the actual technology position that they're talking about. So when folks say, obviously you need cryptocurrencies for the metaverse to be successful, there's a lot of questions there about what do you mean by the metaverse? What do you mean by crypto? And personally, I think there are ways that closed 3D embodied internet experiences could be very successful without requiring globally distributed, trustless cryptocurrency transaction things. There's plenty of ways that you can do ownership of digital items without requiring NFTs. And people will say, oh, yeah, but then you have to rely on a single company. I'm like, you know what? If Blizzard makes a compelling metaverse experience thing with digital item ownership within that, I can see a whole lot of people being very happy just running around in one particular metaverse, owning digital items in that one particular thing, and feeling very much like they were fulfilled by the vision of the metaverse. When other people would point at that and say, "Oh, well, where's the interoperability? Where's the decentralization? Where's the competition between experiences?" I think part of this also depends on where we think this is going to go. Like we got the internet because a bunch of very smart people gifted it to the world effectively, right? Like all of this, all of the research, a lot of it was government sponsored, a lot of it was academic, but it was open. And that's what gave us the internet. I think the problem with things like Web3 and the metaverse is every commercial company in the world now knows how much money there is to be made. So walled garden is the default approach. And only later, maybe we finally see some interoperability.
Well, I think so much of Web3 is a solution looking for a problem. You both alluded to this, that, digital currency is really about distributed trust. So is a lot of the things that they're selling that, it can only be implemented on Web3 and on blockchain and related technologies. And it's not true. There are lots of ways to implement those things. That just happens to be an implementation choice. And this goes back to one of the quotes that I'm most well known for, that in one of the 97 things every software architect should know, is my quote that says, "Developers are drawn to complexity like moths to a flame, frequently with the same result." And it's just something really enticing about, it's a globally distributed blockchain, and understanding the algorithm and understanding how it works. It's like, we've got to use that for something. And it's a solution in search of a problem in a lot of cases. So, I think there are use cases for it, but most of the uses I've seen for it are actually better implemented in different ways. So I think the hype train is really, really heavy with this one. And I think you're both right that they've kind of hitched it to the metaverse and some of the other hype trains that are, chugging along and trying to get them to all go as a group.
Yeah. And as a counterpoint, though, I listen to a few finance podcasts, and there's one with some fast-talking New York finance folks on it. And they were saying, if last year's events in the crypto space have not killed Bitcoin, which is still holding 16,000 as we record this, if they haven't killed Bitcoin, nothing's going to kill it, kind of a thing. And maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe we just don't know how these things are going to pan out and how they're going to end up. I think part of the advice that we try to give in the Looking Glass report is around what people should be doing for all of these technologies. So in the Web3 space, for example, I think our advice would be to be careful before getting involved in it, to be clear about the kinds of things you're trying to achieve, and to kind of put a box around it and be very clear about it. There's a lot of folks who jumped on the NFT hype train, and a lot of which I think is not a very good look right now from a brand perspective to have jumped on that hype train. But that doesn't mean that it's not going anywhere, right? Like, you need to do enough in the Web3 space to understand and stay close to it, so that if it does take off, if Web3 payments become a big thing, you can understand that as a business and get involved in it.
I think you just hit on something there that applies to all the lenses, really, but especially these three that we've been kind of drilling down into. Is that as a business, you have to be prepared for what might happen. And there's enough that, just the way that user experience happens in a metaverse thing, the interactions are different in a 3D situation than they are otherwise. If you don't have any idea how to interoperate with a blockchain, if you don't have any idea how to incorporate AI into your product, and there is a sea change, and fruit manufacturer out of Silicon Valley comes out with new AR glasses, and the whole market changes, you do have to be ready. So there's a lot of this stuff in here that we're like, I don't know if it's mainstream. We said, like, is there any there, that sort of things. There's a lot of these where the answer to that's not clear, but that doesn't mean that as an organization, you shouldn't be preparing and building capabilities and building understanding.
And one of the things that, and Ken was just touching on this, but one of the things that doesn't come out as much in the written version of this is the synergy between these things. These are treated mostly as discrete things, but a lot of what we've been talking about is the synergy, because like everything in the technology world, there are no clean binaries. Everything's sort of a messy spectrum. And a lot of these things end up influencing each other. So, to Ken's point that, if the metaverse really takes off in the 3D, virtual world avatar sense, then, Web3 is probably going to be an integral part of that in terms of payments and, distributed trust. The question then becomes, exactly how do you implement those things? And I think it's important for all these things to separate the thing that you're after from the implementation of how you're getting it. And we get bogged down a lot in the solution versus the problem. And I think some of these reflect exactly that tendency that we have in the technology world. All right. So any last words about the process of creating these things? Anything that really surprised you during as you were putting these things together? Any things that almost made it, didn't quite, that was worth...
And so probably the biggest observation about the process is that this report in the state, if you go to thoughtworks.com and look at Looking Glass, is really, it's global. It's not industry specific. It's not market specific. It's not, anything like that. And so what a lot of companies have done, several actually, and we're here to help with this, is say, okay, how do we take a framework like this or a template like this and apply it to an industry or an individual company or what have you? Because there are things here that we're saying, globally, this should be the tack on X. Whereas for finance, if you're a bank, that is going to change the focus of some of these lenses, to use the pun. And so there's a lot of that where we had to go at a fairly high level on some of this, where it's really interesting sometimes. And like I said, we've done it in several cases. Really drilling into it gets really interesting.
So underneath the 6 lenses we've got, there's actually 100 individual technology trends in there. And we categorize those technology trends by how soon we think they are appearing, how far over the horizon they are, or whether they're with us today. And also like how urgent it is to make a response to those individual technology trends. But again, that advice is fairly broad. And if you're in a specific industry, a specific company, then your interpretation of the positioning of those things might well be different. So what has been super useful is for teams of people to use this as kind of a starting point and say, okay, what do we think about our context? So either our company or our division or our department, our team. Do we agree with this kind of thinking from Thoughtworks that is kind of industry wide? Would we modify it? Does it cause us, what has Thoughtworks not included that we see that is important? And how do we want to respond? How should we respond to these technology trends that we've identified? So the thing I like about it is it's a framework for causing you to think about things and to seek extra input from what's going on in the world and to be able to kind of factor that into your own decision making. So, and this report doesn't exist in a vacuum. We don't expect people to just read the Thoughtworks report and not read the ones from any of the other kind of companies out there in the industry. And so I hope that this is a good piece of input that isn't exactly the same as all the other pieces of input that you're reading. It's got the Thoughtworks perspective on it. I think regular listeners will understand roughly where we're coming from on things and how we differ with some of the other organizations in how we think about stuff. And that is borne out in the Looking Glass. And that, to me, makes it a good starting point for people to consider how their world is impacted by these technology trends, and also any other technology that we didn't feature that they think is important.
I think that's really key. That's actually what I was going to say is exactly that. And don't take our word for it. This is a good template for going through this exercise yourself. It's very easy in the technology world to get caught up in the day-to-day of the tactical things that you have to worry about. And then the strategic things start, falling away because you haven't addressed those things. So this is a way to kind of encourage you to think about the near-term future and use this sort of as a starting point. But, I think individual companies and individuals will come up with their own list of really important things to look for. And I think that's a useful exercise. And that's a good time to wrap up this edition. So we'll try to remember next year about this time to come back and see how we did in our predictions, although our predictions are pretty light. We're not, trying to predict the sports teams' winnings or anything. These seem pretty safe, but we'll see how the world has changed. The people who created this was pretty fortunate because I think between the time you wrote the lens and it was actually published, ChatGPT blew up and became all the rage. And so you were exactly dead on with that one. So we'll see how.
Partnering with AI certainly seems relevant in the face of ChatGPT. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So thanks so much, Mike and Ken, for your effort on that and spending some time giving us a really nice overview of the Looking Glass. We strongly encourage people to go read The Real Thing. There's a lot of information there and some good actionable advice to take away and get to see what our perspective on the near future is. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Neal.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. And I hope you come back for the next episode of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. Have a great rest of your day.